Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's panel discussion, UCI Counts, the Importance of the Census 2020. Thank you all for joining us today. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be available within 1 to 2 business days on the ASUCI and Humanities Center website. My name is Carissa Sorensen, and I am the Director of the Social Sciences Academic Resource Center. Before I introduce our moderator, I'll be providing a quick outline of today's session and overview of Zoom features. We'll be starting off with a brief introduction of the census, and then each of our panelists will have the opportunity to speak about how the census personally shapes their work. After all panelists speak, we will then be addressing your questions during the Q&A portion. To submit questions to the panelists, we'll be using the Zoom chat feature. At the bottom of your screen, you will find a row of icons. Click on the chat bubble icon. This will open the chat on the right, and then you can type your question into the chat box. If you encounter any technical difficulties, please let us know through the chat box. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Bill Maurer, Dean of the School of Social Sciences and Professor of Anthropology, Law, and Criminology, Law and Society.
Well, thank you so much, Carissa, and thank you to everyone for being here for this important panel discussion. The census takes place every 10 years, and it's a survey of all the people who reside in the United States. It's not just for citizens, but counts everyone in the country. The results are used to allocate government funding, to provide social services, as well as to determine political apportionment. In addition, the results of the census are very important for researchers and community advocates who use the data to study our society, identify pressing needs, and develop targeted interventions. UC Irvine was undercounted in the last census, and our students, staff, and faculty are likely to fall into officially designated hard-to-count categories of people, which include young children, highly mobile persons, racial and ethnic minorities, non-English speakers, low-income people, people experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity, undocumented immigrants, people who distrust the government, LGBTQ people, people with disabilities, and those who don't live in traditional housing. As of March 23rd, the UCI response rate was around 22.6%. So a group of UC Irvine faculty, staff, students, and community members have been meeting since early winter to discuss ways to outreach to the UCI community to help us achieve a more complete count. And this panel is an outgrowth of those efforts. Joining us today are the following panelists. And as Carissa said, each will speak in turn, and at the end, we'll have some time for Q&A. We'll have Lynda Laughlin first, the Chief of Industry and Occupation Statistics Branch of the Social, Economic, and Housing Statistics Division at the U.S. Census Bureau. Then Marianne Fu, Executive Director of Orange County Asian Pacific Islander Community Alliance. Then Judy Tzu-Chun Woo, Director of the Humanities Center and Professor of Asian American Studies in the UCI School of Humanities. Then Kaaryn Gustafson, Director of the Center on Law, Equality, and Race, and Associate Dean of Academic Community Engagement and Professor of Law in the UCI School of Law. And finally, Matthew Freedman, Executive Director of the California Census Research Data Center and Professor of Economics here in the UCI School of Social Sciences. So with that, I will turn it over to our first panelist, Lynda Laughlin.
Hi, I'm really excited to be joining you today to discuss this really important historical event that only happens every 10 years. And as it happens, tomorrow, April 1st, is what we would call Census Day. And that's the day we picked as a frame of reference of where you were in the United States on Census Day. Many of these points were already mentioned earlier, but just to reinforce the importance of why the census matters so much. We only do this full population count every 10 years, and it really does take the 9 years in between to get ready for this full count. The count helps to establish the billions of dollars that'll be used to fund many of the programs within your communities, and the results are also used to determine your congressional representation in the United States. In addition to the decennial census, which happens on state size, we also do a census count of the island areas. So this includes Guam, American Samoa, U.S. Virgin Islands, and the Northern Marinara Islands. And they get, this is the only time they ever get a federal households or federal count, a full count from the U.S. Census Bureau. But more importantly, in terms of how the census impacts my life, this is my second census. So I started at the U.S. Census Bureau in 2006. So I had 2010 under my belt, and now I'll have 2020. But the census forms sort of the foundation for much of the survey research that we do at the U.S. Census Bureau. So every time we do a new census, we will readjust our survey weights, we'll readjust our sampling frame for how we send out surveys for our other surveys that we collect through the U.S. Census Bureau. So it has large ramifications not only for our general count of the population, but it has a big impact on the social science research that many of us do. On this next slide, there are many different resources that you can go to on the Census Bureau website. So if you go to 2020census.gov, you'll find much of the information that you may need to sort of figure out what are the questions, who should answer the survey, what's the time frame for completing the census. You can also follow the census on social media, on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to get up-to-date information about what's going on with decennial, what the response rates may be in your community, and how to encourage others to fill out the census. And you can also follow many of our stories on America Counts. It's the Census Bureau sort of blog that helps to promote different issues related to the 2020 census, and there's snapshots of some of the recent stories that we've put out. But America Counts also talks about other surveys that we work at the US Census Bureau. And like I said, the 2020 census and every census sort of helps lay the foundation for our other survey work at the US Census Bureau. And lastly, we won't play this video today, but I encourage you to click on this link and to watch this video. And I believe other panelists will speak about this later, but it's really important to know for college students where you should be counted, especially in light of the COVID crisis. So just, I highly recommend watching this video, but you should be counted where you would have been on April 1st. Follow the links and we'll have more information about that later in the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Marianne Fu, and I'm the Executive Director of the Orange County Asian and Pacific Islander Community Alliance, also known as OCAPICA. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how the census has shaped our work. And a lot of the references I'm using are around the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities as an example. So why the census matters? Well, the census, I've been through in Orange County now, this will be my 4th census. And the census matters because it really helped us to start our organization. So a little bit about our nonprofit is that we're the largest Asian American Pacific Islander serving organization in the area. We have over 100 staff and we speak 26 languages. We serve about 40,000 throughout Orange County. We have 9 office sites. And as an organization, this is our 3rd census. And so why this is really important is that we use the data from the census for everything we do. When we planned our programs, health, mental health, workforce development, youth and education, and civic engagement, it was really based on the community needs and what we saw from the demographic information from the census. Why we speak 26 languages? Because we saw through the census data that there were so many different languages in Orange County, we needed to be able to choose the top and be able to serve the community in this way. So this shows a little bit about what we've done in the 2000 and the 2010 census, and in reaching a lot of communities and educating the community about why the census is vital. It brings resources, it brings information, it helps our communities, and it helps our communities to understand more about funding, federal funding that comes into all of our cities and into our county as well. The other thing that the census has done is it really transformed Orange County. And so right now what we found out from the census in 2010 and why it's so vital to complete the census in 2020 is that it transformed the populations of Orange County. Orange County right now, because of what we found in 2020 census, was we're the 3rd largest Asian American Pacific Islander community in the nation. We have the 3rd largest number of Asian American and Pacific Islander owned businesses that bring in $20 billion into this county. It also helped us to disaggregate data and show the needs of Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. If you aggregate us, we look at our needs look pretty good, but once you disaggregate data, you'll see really high needs among Southeast Asians and Pacific Islanders. And finally, it also transforms civic engagement and leadership. By showing this data to our communities, people could get really excited and see how much they contribute, see how much populations are in different cities. And in fact, because of that, we had a record number of Asian Americans running for office and actually winning. And so for our current Board of Supervisors, it is an Asian majority that represents the Board of Supervisors. And so this data is not only beneficial to our communities in terms of services and resources, but it really helps to plan long-term programs, organizations that are developed, as well as policies and growth. And these are just a few of our partners that we've been working with in getting out the information around census and promoting it to all of our communities. For Asian Americans, what's great is that the Census Bureau provides a lot of these data analysis tools. So this is a map that shows the hard to count, and we're able to plan, how to reach our communities based on these demographic tools and these mapping tools. And we can see where's the largest and highest percentage of hard to count and how do we outreach to them. And so in our communities, how we're outreaching is we're using these strategies: trusted messengers, training other people to do outreach, using youth and young adults, ethnic and social media, supporting multiple social and cultural networks, and reinforcing and promoting the census at every opportune time so people realize how important it is and that they fill this out, because reaching the hard to count communities is vital. And finally, just this shows how our communities have transformed with this next generation of leadership. You see, multiple communities. You see Little Saigon, you see Koreatown. In our communities, you see Diamond Jamboree in Irvine. All of these businesses are thriving and just really expanding. So thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank all the people who have been helping to organize, to do outreach with the census, and I especially want to acknowledge Patrick, Carissa, and Jenny Fan for doing so much work in organizing this particular event. My name is Judy Woo. I'm a professor of Asian American history and also the director of the Humanities Center. And when I think about the census, I think about it as a series of conversations that we're having. So the first conversation that we are having with the census is that we're talking to the US state. It's a very uneven conversation that we've had. For example, the first census was held in 1790, but that is also the first year the United States passed its naturalization law, and that law designates who's eligible for naturalized citizenship. And the qualification really reflected those people who already had power in American society at that time. You had to be a free white man in order to become a naturalized citizen. So just think about that, right? The census is to try to capture everybody who lives in the area that is now the United States, but only certain populations can have full rights, have full protections with the state. And it's this law that really designates Asian Americans, almost all of them, in the future as aliens ineligible for citizenship. Along with immigration, sorry if you don't mind, just going back a little bit, thank you. What you see in the first picture are these interrogation scenes, as in this case, a young Chinese boy is trying to enter the United States. And because of immigration exclusion laws, along with the naturalization law, that individual had to go through many hoops, had to really justify who he is, had to go through these very frightening interrogation scenes to be entered into the country. And that second picture that you see is what's called the Asiatic Barred Zone. The United States started passing immigration laws in 1882, going forward. But in 1917, the United States designated nobody from this part of the world could be allowed to enter the country. So you had these exclusion laws at the US border, but if you're able to come into the country, you still face that naturalization barrier, that you are immigrant and eligible for citizenship. And that really accounts for the racialization of Asian Americans even today. the presumption that they're forever foreign. Before we leave this slide, I also want to emphasize that this history, this unequal history between the US state and Asian American Pacific Islanders also resonates for those who are from the Pacific. The third graphic that you see here is a map, and I apologize for how small it is, but maybe you can look it up on your own or you can blow it up on your screen. But this shows all the islands that came into the United States possession in the mid-19th century and the late 19th century. And it really was part of a global strategy of US imperial dominance. Each of these islands were needed as ports, as trading places, at places where US naval ships could refuel. And each of them were building blocks, stepping stones to allow the United States to become a dominant power in the Pacific. So when I talk about the census as a conversation with the state, I can understand why many people who have suspicion of the state, who are racialized individuals, come from marginalized communities, have a great fear about what that information will do or how it will be used. But I want to emphasize that this is really a chance for those who have been marginalized, who have been invisibilized, to say emphatically that we are here in this country. That despite the efforts to exclude us physically, politically, culturally, and socially, we are in the area of the United States and the territories, and that we're demanding political recognition. It's a chance for these communities to talk about the social challenges that they face: poverty, racism, healthcare access, housing insecurity, educational access, that all these demands can be reflected in terms of census data. So the census is not just a one-way conversation that the state imposes on the people, but it's also a conversation that we, the people, are making and claiming in part of the United States. So if you could go to the next slide. So the second conversation I'd like to think about is that the census allows us to have a conversation with the past. And I'm particularly invested in this as a historian. And I think of what I do is trying to tell alternative stories of our past, to think about where we come from so that we can chart a new future. But the question becomes, how do we do this? History tends to be written by the victors. Traditionally, it's about people who have power and influence. So when the social movements in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, including the Asian American movement, demanded that US society acknowledge its history of racism, imperialism, and patriarchy, historians tended to shrug their shoulders and ask, how can we study those without power? How do we study the people who are non-elite? They tended not to write, or at least their writings were not preserved in prestigious archives. They were not important in the past, so they continue not to be important in terms of historical memories. So in response, scholars interested in issues like race, gender, and class came up with new methods of doing history. Some pioneered oral history, the use of spoken word to understand people's lives. And here I want to acknowledge the work of my UCI colleagues with the Viet Stories Oral History Project. Others argue that we need to change the practices of archives so they can help preserve what's valuable for marginalized communities. And here I want to acknowledge the work of my colleague in the Southeast Asian Archive and the ways in which they really prioritize developing community-based archives. And still others turn to statistical information and reinterpreted them. So here the census is incredibly valuable. How many people lived in a particular area? What was their class background? What was their ethnic and racial background? Thinking about the collective experience of large populations of individuals. And you think about the various ways in which Asian American Pacific Islander communities have interacted with the state. There's a paper trail for much of those interactions. And you might be able to reinterpret those interactions, not just from the point of view, again, of the state, but from the people who are encountering the state. How are they exerting resistance? How are they demonstrating subtle forms of agency? How are they utilizing social networks and resources, even when they're engaged in that one-on-one interrogation with the state? So the US Census is an incredibly crucial source for us to understand the past. It's inherently flawed because there's errors in counting and there's errors in classification, which is why it's so important for us to have a complete count as much as possible. But it's still a powerful tool. So just to give you my own history of doing history, when I was doing research on my first book, it's the biography of the first Chinese American female doctor, and we see that school annual photo that was her medical school class. I think that was in her second year. She's right in the middle in the front row. And as you can tell, she's the only woman and she's the only Asian American, right? To try to imagine what that experience was like. And on her left is her father, an image that I found. And as I was doing research on her life, it was a way for me to think about, how do I trace her family? And the census allowed me to gain access to that information. I could find out where they lived, who lived in their household, who their neighbors were, what were their occupations, how did they get marked as from a particular country, or how were they evaluated in terms of their race. This information is confidential over the period of 72 years. So that's the average lifespan of an individual. So that level of detail is not available. But it's so important and such a rich set of materials that allows us to imagine what it would have been like to live in the United States in the past, and a glimpse into the lives of ordinary people. So I'm just going to very briefly talk about the next two slides. The third conversation, Patrick, if you don't, oh yes, thank you. I won't go into this great detail, but I just want to say that I think the census is also a conversation that we have with our community, especially given the representation of Asian Americans as model minorities, as hardworking, high-achieving individuals who do not need any support, do not engage in activism. It's so important to have that aggregate and disaggregated portrait of our communities, and you had a sense of that from Mary Ann Fu's discussion. And I'll just end with the last slide. This beautiful set of artwork is done by an Asian American Studies student, Nikki Oy, who worked with OCAPICA, Mary Ann Fu's organization. And I just want to emphasize again that what we do today, with the census, will have a long-term impact. People will look at us 100 years from now and ask, how did we live our lives given the impact of the coronavirus? How did we live our lives in terms of sheltering in place? And the census gives us a glimpse of that time period. So again, what we do today really matters for tomorrow. Thank you.
So my name is Kaaryn Gustafson. I'm a professor of law at UC Irvine School of Law, and I'm director of the Center on Law, Equality, and Race, which is also known as CLEAR. I'm going to talk about why the census is important to legal advocates and why it's important to legal scholars, and I will try and keep my comments short. First, the census documents population shifts, including important changes in racial and ethnic composition of communities. And a lot of people feel uncomfortable marking a box of race or ethnicity. And the census does ask respondents to self-identify their racial and ethnic backgrounds. But you get to choose what you write. The questionnaire allows people to choose multiple boxes. And this year's census form asks respondents to provide more refined data about ethnic origin, right? You can document your own history and experience and identity through the form. This is very important to both legal scholars and social scientists in studying the changing demographics in America. Second, the census is used to determine how many representatives each state sends to the U.S. House of Representatives, and the census is used for redistricting purposes. Census data are used in legislative redistricting, redrawing the boundaries of federal and state electoral districts. Historically, people of color have tended to have lower response rates. This is particularly true for Blacks and Latinos. But it is important that the census count be as accurate as possible. The importance of this is highlighted by the fact that this session was interrupted by white nationalists, right? Suppressing the census is part of suppressing political engagement. Be aware of that. Fill out the census. Undercounts can distort electoral districts so that redrawn districts don't accurately reflect the constituencies in communities. While people might feel uncomfortable indicating racial and ethnic data, it is that data that courts and legal advocates use in determining whether electoral maps have been drawn to dilute the voting power of particular racial and ethnic subpopulations. Therefore, documenting race and ethnicity in this context is important. This is particularly important for racial gerrymandering cases, which draw on both the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and the Voting Rights Act. And the US Supreme Court describes racial gerrymandering as, quote, intentionally assigning citizens to a district on the basis of race without sufficient justification. If people don't fill out the census, there's no way to get a sense of whether racial gerrymandering is going on. Third, the US Census is used to allocate federal funds. Much of this federal money is used to fund the programs that ensure the basic needs of citizens and that provide the basics in access to food, shelter, and education. This funding flows to healthcare, to publicly funded education, to food assistance programs, including school lunches and SNAP programs, to housing assistance and public education. Given persistent racial and geographic inequalities in wealth and income and in rates of poverty, these programs are often vital to the well-being of America's most vulnerable individuals, families, and communities, and to the promise of young people's future of political, economic, and social participation in the United States. Finally, as Judy Woo noted, the census is a snapshot of a population at a given time. Therefore, legal historians will be using this data for years. I'm one of those people who's using census data now. I'm exploring the history of free Black families before and after the Civil War, and census data have been invaluable in that research. Years from now, the records you provide to the census will be used by future historians. So please respond to the census survey. Your participation is important to the political, economic, and social well-being of your community. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Matthew Friedman. I'm a professor of economics at UC Irvine and also the executive director of the California Census Research Data Center we have on campus. So I just want to start by saying thank you for organizing this fantastic event and the opportunity to be here to stress the importance of Census 2020. It's both a blessing and a curse to go last. A blessing because I don't have to worry about failing to mention any important points. A lot of crucial points have already been raised, but also a curse, of course, because there's little left to add on top of the great discussion that's happened so far. So I'll just say that in addition to the critical importance of the census for the allocation of federal funds for hospitals, for schools, for roads, and much more, as well as in determining district lines for voting and representation, and thereby ensuring that we all have equal say over the government policies and programs that affect our everyday lives. The census plays a key role in an enormous amount of research that happens in academia, nonprofits, and more. Of course, not just in social sciences, where I sit, but also in planning, in business, in public health, in education, and many other areas. Indeed, not only does the decennial census itself shed important light on national, state, and local population growth, as well as patterns of population change and segregation, for example, by race and ethnicity, which is a key focus of a lot of my research. But also, of course, integrating census data with other data sets, for example, on, say, pollution, traffic congestion, disease transmission, which of course is top of mind for many. We can learn about the populations that are affected by various city and neighborhood level phenomenon, and vice versa, of course, how different government policies and other environmental factors affect population growth and compositional change. So that's a key aim of the Research Data Center that I direct here at UC Irvine. So the RDC is in fact a partnership between federal statistical agencies and leading research institutions that facilitate access to important data, of course, like the decennial census, for research purposes. So the RDC brings together researchers from a variety of disciplines, including economics, of course, but also sociology, education, public health, business, and more, to study important, timely questions on an array of different topics. So much of the research that comes out of the RDC and research in general using census data represent key inputs into the policymaking process. And while certainly I'm not an expert on it and don't know the details myself, I know there's already substantial research underway, for example, studying COVID and disease transmission that leverages census data together with other housing, public health data. So I'll stop there. Thank you again for participating in this really important event, and thank you for responding to the 2020 decennial census.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you to the panelists. We have an opportunity now for people to post questions in using the chat function of Zoom. But as we wait for a few people to post a few questions, I just wanted to start off with one that I know is on the minds of a lot of members of our UC Irvine community, which is how should UC Irvine students be counted, especially because many of them have dispersed across the country. They've gone to their parents' house or some other place and won't actually be on campus on April 1st.
I'll just start, and I'm sure Lynda has more information. So when we complete the census, we need to let the government know where we are on April 1st. That's why it's called Census Day. But for students who have relocated because of COVID-19, because of sheltering in place, they should still answer as if they are in their regular residence. So if they regularly live in the student dorms, that's the address in which they should mark down where they're located, even if they're not physically there on April 1st.
Yeah, I'll add to what Judy just said. It seems odd, and you may not be in your dorm or living in your campus apartment anymore, but if you would have been living there on April 1st, you should fill out the census based on the residence you would have been at on April 1st. And don't forget to include your roommates. If you had roommates living with you and they've maybe moved back home or gone somewhere else, if they would have been living with you at that time, you should include your roommates as well. Again, I really recommend going to the 2020census.gov website and watching that video to get more information. It seems confusing, but it's really important to be counted where you were residing on April 1st because it has such a large impact on your community.
Excellent, thank you. So again, to reiterate, you respond with the residence where you should have been on April 1st if there was no global pandemic, right? Another thing is that because now they're not on campus, won't have received their invitation letter from the census in the mail. So what did they?
Well, you don't even have to have that invitation to go to fill it out. You can actually go to the census website and go to fill out your question, the census itself. And when you put in an address, we can use the address of where you would have been on April 1st to link it to the address, to the special code you would have received. And the very smart people at Census Bureau can make sure to not that there's no double counting on that. So if you don't have the official invite with the, like, it has a special code on it that you can enter, you just enter the address of where you would have been on April 1st. And you can always wait for a paper form that may also come if that doesn't happen. And the last thing that will happen, if the Census Bureau did not hear a response for you, we do have our field reps who will be visiting households probably later in April or early May, depending on our planning around COVID. But we do have a huge workforce that will be contacting households directly to help finish the count.
So I just want to encourage everybody to answer either online or on the phone. There's different languages available, especially for students, staff, or faculty who have family members who might be more comfortable in other languages. So there is multilingual material available. And also, if you're trying to avoid people coming to your house, it's best to do this sooner than later. And also, it saves some trees. So the census is monitoring as people submit. And the sooner you submit, the fewer paper form that they have to send out.
I'd also like to note how little time it takes to do the census. I actually set a timer when I did my census, and it took 7 minutes. So it's quick and easy.
And we have a question in the chat asking about how the census has changed at all because of the COVID-19 situation.
Well, the questionnaire hasn't changed. It's still the same 10 questions. Certainly, I would recommend going again to the 2020 census.gov webpage for updates. But we do have, we are not sending out our field reps in mid-April as we planned. We're pushing that back. So some of the collection process has been delayed, and typically we try to finish up the count by the end of July, but we did get approval from Congress to push out the final, like, last-ditch count attempt until August. So we are pushing that goalpost a little bit back to account for the global pandemic.
We're also trying to reach people in different strategies now through a lot of social media, a lot of ethnic media, by phone banking, to really encourage people to fill out the census as well. And there was another question about, what about undocumented community members? And one thing I really want to stress is that everyone should fill out the census. Even if you're undocumented, the census is protected. It's confidential, and all information is protected. If you live in overcrowded housing, you know, the information cannot be used against you. No one can come and investigate and say, well, we understand there's people who are undocumented living in this household, or there's 20 people living. That will never be used against you. There are strict laws in place to protect this data for confidentiality.
I just wanted to underscore something that other panelists have talked about, and I think this speaks to why it's so important for everybody to be counted regardless of their status and regardless of their citizenship. The funding is used to allocate really important social services. So education, even water allocation, is based on census count. And so again, it's so important for all of us to be counted.
There's a question that's come in too about international students. Can someone speak to the situation for international students?
Lynda, perhaps you can correct us, but I think the same situation applies, that they should respond as if wherever they would have been normally on April 1st. So if they were going to school at UCI and would have been in residence, except for COVID-19, that's where they should indicate where they're located. Is that correct, Lynda?
Yes, that's correct. So basically, it's whoever is on U.S. soil on April 1st, that reference date that we use. So if you're an international student, And if you've had to move away from campus or somewhere else, you need to be counted because you would have been here technically on April 1st. If you are no longer in the country, but maybe have roommates that are still in the States, that's a conversation. Make sure that let them know that you should be part of that count.
And there's another question about what can people expect if and when census takers show up at their door? Just because we know that there are a lot of scams and there could be fraud, you never quite know who it is who's coming up to your door. How will I know that it's a census taker?
Just like any survey that would be collected by the U.S. Census Bureau, and this includes the decennial census, the Census Bureau, we call them FRs or field representatives, they will have a badge. So if you have any questions, you can always ask the representative to show you their badge. And also know that all of our field reps are, they've been through security clearance, and they also take an oath with the U.S. Census Bureau that they will not share your information. And if they if they do, they are actually could be fined and jailed. So always look for a badge. They usually have a census laptop bag, but the badge is the best indication of making sure that you're talking to a census rep.
Another question has come in as well about data security and data safety for people who might be worried about that.
I'll try to answer the best I can. I know that the U.S. Census Bureau has put in a tremendous amount of research and funding to making sure that the count is secure. This is the first time that we are collecting information with an internet option. We did not do that in 2010 due to some funding issues and not being able to get it off the ground, but we can ensure that your data is confidential and it's protected, and we've put a lot of safeguards in to protect your response.
Well, thank you. If there are no other questions, then I think I just want to underscore some of the key points that were made here, which is just the unbelievable importance of the census, that April 1st is Census Day, and that we are counted, even in spite of the pandemic and sheltering in place, we're counted in the place that we would have been and should have been on April 1st if there had been no pandemic. So for students who are not on campus right now, you fill out your census form as if you were, because that's where you should have been on April 1st. You can go to the website that's right there on the screen. If you haven't received a paper form in the mail, it's no big deal. Just go right online, enter your address. The good people and the algorithms at the census will figure out to match you with that place. And the census will then go out with in-person visits and field visits for places there that are having a low response rate. And that's probably going to happen in May through August. It might change, obviously, given the situation that we're in right now. But again, it's unbelievably important that people get counted. And that means everybody, regardless of your status, regardless of your citizenship. This is such an important moment. It only happens every 10 years, and it determines so much of what happens in this country. Before we close, I just want to thank again our panelists, Lynda, Laughlin, Marianne Fu, Judy Woo, Kaaryn Gustafson, and Matthew Freedman. I also want to thank the UCI Counts Committee. There were a lot of people who were involved, and you can see some of the sponsors and names here on the screen. But I really want to thank Judy Woo for rallying everyone behind this effort, as well as Carissa Sorensen, Patrick Del Rosario, and Jenny Fan for helping this event come to life. Our co-sponsors are listed on the slide. I won't name them all. Thank you all so much. Thank you for joining us. Please fill out the census and take care.